The radio crackled once and then went silent. No static, no voice, nothing but the faint hiss that marked the end of a signal. Men on the patrol looked at one another, waiting for someone to say what none of them wanted to admit. Out at the wire fence, all they found was a rifle strewn in the dirt, streaked with blood, and drag marks vanishing into the dark. At Forward Operating Base Red Mesa, the word spread like fire. Sergeant Arya Monroe had been taken. Her name was scratched off the duty roster. The captain muttered under his breath, "Figures. Intel sergeants fold when it gets close." Laughter followed, forced and brittle, a funeral without a body. Hours crawled by, 14 of them, and then the war room froze mid-briefing. The tent flap snapped open, canvas slapping against the pole. Arya stepped through. Her uniform was torn. Sand crusted her face, wrists raw where ties had been cut, and behind her shuffled 9 Taliban fighters, hands flex-scuffed, heads bowed, the same men who were supposed to have dragged her off into the mountains. A colonel's coffee mug halted in midair, the steam curling into silence. Not a word was spoken, because the quiet intel sergeant, the one they had written off, had just walked back into the war room, dragging with her a victory no one had predicted. For a moment, no one moved. Rangers in the briefing circle stared as if they were seeing a ghost. This wasn't how legends looked. Arya Monroe was 5'4", built like a distance runner, more likely to be mistaken for a contractor than a commando. She wasn't supposed to come back, and she definitely wasn't supposed to return with prisoners. But there she stood. Inside, the last 14 hours burned in her memory like coals. The collapsed shaft she had crawled through, the raw eyes of the hostages when she cut their bonds, the cold mountain wind that had stripped her breath and her fear away. Those details stayed, locked behind her silence. Captain Blake Turner leaned forward, disbelief curdling into irritation. He wanted to strip the legend before it grew. He wanted to reduce what she had done to chance, to luck. But one look at the 9 prisoners behind her made it impossible. Luck didn't put zip ties on armed men. Arya kept her gaze forward. She didn't look at the colonel, didn't acknowledge the whispers circling the room. She walked as if this was nothing more than another daily report. But her silence was louder than their mutters. By the time the gates of the fob slammed shut behind her, everyone understood one truth. This wasn't the same sergeant they thought they had ignored. Something had shifted, something permanent. When Colonel Adrian Lockatch finally spoke, his voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Get her in the debrief room." But the real story didn't begin there. It began long before Red Mesa, long before Afghanistan, long before anyone thought a woman could outfox the Taliban. Arya Monroe had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Why did she always choose the hardest path? That question lived in the back of her mind even as a girl. Montana winters weren't forgiving, but her grandfather believed in them as teachers. Weekends were never for sleeping in or football games. Not for Arya. They meant being dropped 10 miles from home with nothing but a map, a compass, and a canteen. Her grandfather, Elias Monroe, a Vietnam War long-range patrol scout, gave simple orders: find your way back. Trust your training, not your fear. The mountains became her first classroom. Snowdrifts taught her how wind could reshape a landscape overnight. Elk trails showed her how to separate fresh movement from tracks a week old. At 16, she could tell from the bend of grass whether someone walked burdened or light, stranger or neighbor. She learned patience from shadows, caution from silence, and survival from every cut of cold that bled her lungs raw. Those lessons carved themselves into her bones. Long before the army issued her a uniform, Arya was already living by rules older than doctrine. Blend, observe, vanish. At Fort Huxton's intelligence school, instructors noticed quickly. She didn't just read maps, she felt them. Satellite imagery wasn't pixels to her, it was terrain, memory, instinct. During SEER training at Fort Bragg, she lasted 6 days on the run when most recruits barely managed 2. When instructors tracked her prints into a canyon, they found nothing but silence. She had doubled back, scaled a rock face no one else considered, and disappeared. It wasn't long before a recruiter from a shadow program appeared. He wasn't looking for the biggest or the loudest. He wanted someone overlooked, underestimated, invisible. That's how Arya Monroe slipped into the Army's most secretive branch of intelligence support activity. A unit whispered about in half sentences. The people who disappear into hostile territory, gather what satellites cannot, and return without leaving a trace. Afghanistan was her crucible. Male soldiers glanced at her badge and saw only a female analyst. Taliban fighters saw nothing at all. That invisibility was her armor. That underestimation was her weapon. Still, nothing prepared her for the mission briefing that set everything in motion. The room was packed. Rangers, air controllers, intel officers, maps glowing against canvas walls. Captain Turner stood at the front, stabbing his finger at a drone feed. 20 fighters, Taliban compound. They're holding 4 hostages. 1 American contractor, a British nurse, 2 NGO staffers. We hit at 0300. Arya raised her hand, calm, precise. Captain, I've been tracking this cell for months. Their pattern shows they move prisoners at 0200 every 3rd night. Tonight is the 3rd night. At 0300, that compound will be empty. Turner didn't even look at her. His jaw flexed. He clicked to the next slide. Intel sticks to analysis. Operators handle combat. The silence was heavy. Even the Air Force combat controller shifted in his seat. Arya tried again. She pulled up her report. 67 days of surveillance, guard rotations logged to the minute. This isn't theory, it's field work. Turner waved her off. We've got real-time drone coverage. That's what matters, not your paper trails. From the corner, Colonel Lockitch's voice came, dismissive. Intel always thinks it knows better. That's why you sit behind desks while we do the real work. Heat rose in Arya's chest, but she didn't flinch. She closed her report, her voice low, calm. Sir, I've been inside that compound twice. The room exploded. Chairs scraped back. Turner slammed his palm against the table. Impossible. Nobody gets inside without authorization. But Arya didn't back down. She tapped her tablet. Images glowed across the plywood table. Hallways mapped from the inside, guard rotations down to the minute, a collapsed shaft beneath the north wall that no satellite could ever see. Silence. Turner's glare was fury and disbelief wrapped in one. Colonel Lockitch finally looked up, his eyes sharp as steel. Unauthorized reconnaissance. Do you realize you could have compromised this entire operation? Arya held his gaze. They don't know I exist. Sir, to them, I'm a faceless villager collecting wood. I've walked past their sentries 30 times. Not once have they looked at me. The tent froze. Turner laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. What's your angle, Sergeant? Want to tag along? Pretend you're one of us for a night. Arya's tone stayed level. No, sir. I'm telling you, your raid at 0300 will hit an empty compound. The hostages will be gone at 0200, and your men will be walking into an ambush. The captain's fist slammed down. Enough. But Arya slid a folder across the table. Page after page of shorthand notes. The ember of a cigarette 6 minutes into every shift, the cook scattering dirt over the tunnel entrance, the commander's boots worn smooth at the soles. These weren't theories. They were rhythms. Human rhythms, invisible to satellites but undeniable to anyone who watched closely enough. Unease rippled through the room. Colonel Lockitch's voice dropped. The mission proceeds as planned. Sergeant Monroe, you're confined to base pending review. The words landed like a gavel, final, dismissing her as if she hadn't spoken at all. But inside, Arya already knew what she would do. Back in her hooch, the walls pressed close. On her pack leaned a photo of her grandfather, Elias Monroe, the scout who once refused to lead his men into a kill zone. 12 soldiers lived because instinct mattered more than rank. She opened her notebook. Pencil lines marked every detail she had logged: cigarettes, boots, wastewater on packed dirt. Small things, but together they told a truth no one else wanted to see. She lifted the lid of her footlocker. A plain tunic, a headscarf, worn sandals, a disguise. Next to them a bottle of goat's blood insurance. Enough to stage what she needed, the illusion of capture. She checked her watch, 22:30. Guards would shift in 30 minutes. The real deadline was midnight. At 0300 the raid would be too late. She wrapped the scarf around her hair, whispered the words her grandfather had taught her. Trust your training, not your fear. Then she stepped into the Afghan night. The wind pressed sharp against her face, every step chosen, every sound weighed. At the fence line, a young guard lit his cigarette. The ember glowed in the dark exactly 6 minutes into his shift. His eyes stayed fixed on his phone. Routine, predictable, weakness. Arya slipped past him like smoke. The Afghan night pressed close, sharp and watchful. Each breath carried dust, each heartbeat measured in silence. Arya Monroe wrapped the scarf tighter, not just against the cold, but against the feeling that her own skin might betray her. Why was it always her? Why did the responsibility of acting alone feel less frightening than the weight of waiting, while others ignored what she knew? She pushed the thought aside. This wasn't the time to ask questions without answers. Her sandals scuffed against the earth, her posture stooped into the hunch of a villager. A head bowed, a back bent. To the sentries, she was nobody. To herself, she was every lesson her grandfather had drilled into her. The invisible path is often the strongest one. At the motor pool, the outlines of Hilux trucks loomed like sleeping beasts. She paused. One breath. Two. Then she moved, swift but precise, fingers slipping beneath the hood. She tugged a fuse loose, just enough to turn ignition into silence. Another Hilux, she loosened the fuel line, letting it drip slow and deadly. By the time anyone tried to run, they'd be stranded in their own trap. She crouched low, breath steady. The compound loomed ahead, stone walls dark against the starlit sky. Beneath it, the collapsed shaft yawned open. To most, it looked like a tomb. To Arya, it was a doorway. She lowered herself into the narrow crawl, gravel scraping her palms, dirt sprinkling into her scarf. Childhood memories cut sharp. Montana mine shafts, summers spent crawling through passages tighter than this. Places where silence wasn't optional, it was survival. She let those memories guide her now. Every inch forward was a prayer of muscle and patience. At last, cool stone pressed against her cheek. She froze, listening. Above, muffled laughter, glass clinking, voices rough with the certainty of men who believed they were safe. 3 guards, 2 outside the cellar, 1 inside. Her watch read 01:30. The hostages would be moved at 02:00. Turner's raid was suicide. Her grandfather's words echoed. When everyone else is wrong and you're right, you don't wait for permission. You act. She steadied herself. A pebble clattered against metal. Intentional, expected. One guard outside shifted, grumbling, moving to check. The second followed, their footsteps fading. Arya slid forward, shoulders tight, breath shallow, until she reached the cellar. The air was heavy with kerosene. Lantern light flickered against stone. One guard slumped in a chair, an AK balanced across his lap. His chin sagged with fatigue. And then she saw them. 4 captives, 1 American contractor, beaten but alert, a British nurse clutching a bloody bandage to her side, 2 NGO staffers barely conscious, faces pale with exhaustion. The contractor lifted his head, bloodied face shadowed, but his eyes sharp, assessing. Not just a civilian. Arya recognized it instantly, the watchfulness of a soldier. Former SAS, she guessed. The guard stirred, decision time. She moved, smooth, silent, sliding behind him, locking her arm around his throat, applying just enough pressure. 8 seconds. His body sagged. She lowered him to the ground as if laying down a child, gentle but final. The SAS man's eyes locked on hers. No words, just understanding. Arya cut his bonds, pressed her Glock into his hand, then pointed toward a grain sack pile concealing the secondary shaft. His nod was curt, efficient. He turned to free the others. Boots hammered above. Voices barked sharp in Pashto, urgent. The buyer had arrived early. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Time had run out. The cellar door swung open. The Taliban commander stepped inside first. Spetsna boots polished, shoulders stiff with authority. 2 fighters flanked him, rifles raised. And behind them the Pakistani broker, eyes glittering with greed. Arya stood where the prisoners should have been. Head bowed, scarf low, body curved like someone broken. The commander's eyes narrowed. Suspicion cut through his stare. His hand twitched toward his weapon. She moved first, not with violence, with words. Her Pashto was flawless. Rangers, northern perimeter, they're already here. The commander froze. Above, his radio crackled, but not from comrades, from phantom signatures. Arya's beacon, seated earlier, spitting false movement into the ether. To his ears, it sounded like boots closing in, dozens of them. Fear spread quick. Everyone remembered the last Ranger raid. No prisoners, no mercy. Arya pulled a folded page from her tunic. The ops order she had photographed from Turner's briefing. She held it high. North wall breach, 20 minutes. Your tunnels are collapsed. That Hilux by the east gate, it won't save you. The Pakistani broker cursed, bolted for the stairs, panic in his steps. The fighters shifted, eyes darting to their commander. Pride warred with survival. Seconds stretched thin. The commander's jaw locked. His grip loosened. Slowly he lowered his rifle. His men followed, shame and fear battling in their faces. Arya's voice was steady, commanding. On your knees. Daniel, the SAS veteran, raised the Glock, covering them. One by one, the fighters zip-tied each other, wrists pulled tight by their own hands. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Arya's chest rose and fell. Sweat streaked her temple. Fear still whispered in the edges of her mind, but discipline smothered it. She couldn't afford fear. Not now. The hostages huddled together, blinking against the sudden reversal of fate. Daniel's eyes met hers again. Silent respect. No questions. Not yet. Above them, the compound stirred with confusion. But here, in the cellar, the fight was already over. And Arya Monroe, the intel sergeant they dismissed, had just rewritten the mission. But the hardest part wasn't done, not by a long shot. She hadn't planned for what came next. Because victory, when it comes too fast, always carries its own dangers. The cellar stank of sweat and kerosene. Lantern light flickered against the dirt walls, throwing long shadows across the kneeling figures. 9 Taliban fighters, wrists bound tight with NATO zip ties, their eyes cast downward but burning with a humiliation that would not be forgotten. Arya kept her stance straight, though her arms trembled faintly under the strain of adrenaline. Daniel, the SAS veteran, stood beside her, Glock steady, the muzzle hovering over men who had expected to be the captors, not the captured. The hostages huddled near the wall, their relief edged with disbelief. A British nurse whispered a prayer. One NGO staffer sobbed quietly, too weak to stand. The silence was unbearable. Every creak above, every shifting boot, felt like a countdown to discovery. And then, faint at first but growing, the sound of boots, distant, approaching. Not Rangers, not yet. Arya's hand pressed against her beacon clipped under her tunic. The false signals she'd seeded across the perimeter were still transmitting, weaving illusions of squads moving in, radios buzzing with phantom chatter. But illusions had limits. Eventually, the real would collide with the false. Her watch read 01:55. 5 minutes until the prisoners would have been moved. 5 minutes until the compound above came alive with preparations. Her plan had worked too well. She glanced at Daniel. His eyes flicked toward the hostages. "We can't stay here." He was right. Arya crouched low, speaking in a voice calm but sharp enough to cut through panic. "There's a shaft behind the grain sacks. Leads out past the north wall. Quiet, narrow, you go first, take the civilians." Daniel didn't argue. He moved, helping the nurse to her feet, steadying the NGO workers. The contractor who had been broken into silence found new strength when given purpose. One by one, they slipped toward the hidden passage. Arya stayed, watching, measuring. The commander still knelt among his men, head bowed, but his eyes never left her. Eyes that said, "You've humiliated us tonight. We will remember." She felt the weight of it, a seed planted in silence, waiting for its season to bloom. Her voice was low but commanding. "You'll live tonight because I choose it. Understand this. Your lives are no longer your own. They belong to the men you sold, to the people you chained, to the silence of this floor." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His jaw tightened, his shame carved deeper than words could cut. Boots above again, closer now, confusion spreading. The Pakistani broker must have reached them. Shouts echoed down, sharp with panic. Arya moved fast. She pulled another fuse from her pouch, snapped it between her fingers and dropped it into the lantern. The flame guttered out, plunging the cellar into near darkness. Only her whisper cut through it. "Stay kneeling." She turned, slipping toward the shaft. The tunnel was tighter than memory. Dirt pressed in close, gravel grinding against knees and palms. Every breath carried the taste of earth. Behind her, faint shuffling, the hostages crawling, guided by Daniel's steady hand. Ahead, a sliver of night widened into freedom. Cold air brushed her face, sharp and clean after the stench of the cellar. They emerged one by one. Arya scanned the horizon. The motor pool still slept in silence, Hilux trucks dark and useless from her sabotage. The guard at the fence sat slumped, cigarette ember glowing, unaware of the chaos beneath his watch. She motioned low. Daniel led the hostages into the scrub, bodies bent low against the skyline. Arya stayed last, always last, her rifle angled toward the shadows they had left behind. She expected gunfire, expected shouts, a storm of boots pouring after them, but none came. Not yet. The group moved in silence, breaths ragged, steps uneven. Arya counted each one, measured the distance to the ridge where her beacon pulsed false signatures into the night. Safety lay beyond it, if such a word meant anything here. At the ridge, Daniel halted the group, crouching low, scanning with eyes too sharp to have truly retired. He looked at Arya. "You knew this would work." Her reply was quiet. "No, I only knew what would fail." For the first time, his mouth curved into something like a smile, tired, respectful. "Fair answer." The hostages sagged against the rocks, exhaustion overtaking them now that fear loosened its grip. The nurse pressed her bandaged side, face pale but determined. The contractor murmured thanks, his voice hoarse, broken by more than wounds. Arya crouched apart, eyes fixed on the compound in the distance. Lanterns flared. Shouts carried across the cold air. The realization was dawning inside those walls. Their prisoners gone, their fighters missing, their leader humiliated. The hunt would come. Her watch read 02:20. 40 minutes until Turner's raid struck an empty shell. Her chest tightened at the thought. Men walking into shadows, blind to the truth she had already seen. Command had silenced her warnings. They had chosen pride over caution, and now their pride would cost lives. Unless... She rose, silent, moving toward the beacon. Daniel watched her go, understanding without asking. She crouched by the small transmitter, its red light pulsing steady. It had already bought her time, convincing the commander of a raid that wasn't there. but she could change its purpose now. With a few adjustments, the signal could guide, not mislead. Her fingers worked quick, flipping channels, boosting power. She tuned it to the frequency she knew the Rangers would be using, not to deceive them but to warn them. Static hissed, then faint but clear a voice. "Bravo team, 30 mics out, copy." Her throat tightened. She could speak, she could save them. But if she transmitted, she would reveal herself. She would admit everything: her unauthorized reconnaissance, her disobedience, her deception of her own command. They would court-martial her, strip her rank, destroy her career. She stared at the transmitter, pulse pounding. Fear pressed close, not of the Taliban, not of capture, but of the weight of her own choice. Her grandfather's voice came back, soft but firm: "Trust your training, not your fear." She closed her eyes, then pressed the mic. "Bravo team, adjust approach. Compound compromised, hostages extracted. Do not breach north wall. Repeat, do not breach north wall." Static silence. Then, "Copy, say again, who is this?" Arya's breath hitched. She killed the mic, cut the transmission. She sat in silence, heart hammering. The decision had been made, the risk taken. Now she could only wait. By 02:45 the ridge was quiet. The hostages lay under blankets Daniel had pulled from his pack. Arya crouched on watch, her rifle steady, her gaze fixed on the compound below. Lanterns blazed, voices carried, but no pursuit came. Perhaps humiliation weighed heavier than revenge. Perhaps confusion still clouded their command. And then movement. Distant headlights approaching fast. Daniel tensed, raising the Glock. Arya lowered his hand with calm pressure. "Not them, ours." Moments later, the quick reaction force stormed the compound. Boots thundered, rifles up, but they found no battle waiting. No hostages to rescue. Only 9 fighters zip-tied in silence, their commander's pride crumbling in the dirt. The Rangers under Captain Turner arrived minutes later, fury in their faces, weapons ready for ghosts that weren't there. Arya stayed hidden on the ridge, the hostages safe behind her, Daniel at her side. She didn't move until dawn painted the sky pale. When they finally walked into camp, the whispers began before the gates closed. A dismissed intel sergeant had achieved in one night what a Ranger platoon could not. And no one, not even Arya, was ready for what that meant. The gates of Fob Red Mesa clanged shut behind her, steel on steel echoing across the compound. Soldiers paused in their routines to stare. Some froze mid-step, others whispered. A few laughed nervously as if trying to convince themselves it was all just rumor. But rumor doesn't shuffle 9 Taliban prisoners through the wire. Rumor doesn't drag 4 freed hostages behind a woman they'd written off as invisible. Arya kept her stride even, face expressionless, though inside her pulse hammered. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of dust and diesel. Every sound, the rattle of a generator, the cough of a mechanic, felt amplified under the weight of the eyes on her. She didn't meet them, didn't acknowledge them. Silence was her armor. But silence couldn't protect her from what came next. The debrief. The room was small, canvas walls taut against the desert wind. A single folding table, 2 metal chairs. Harsh light from a dangling bulb. Arya sat on one side, her posture straight, her face unreadable. On the other side, Captain Blake Turner leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table's edge. His fury was quiet now, sharpened into something colder than rage. "You disobeyed direct orders," he said, voice low. "You endangered this mission. You staged your own disappearance. You lied to your commanding officers. And you," his eyes flicked to the report in front of him, "you humiliated this unit in front of the entire FOB." Arya's hands rested on the table, still as stone. She didn't answer. Because anything she said could be twisted into an excuse, and excuses would only feed him. Colonel Adrian Lockatch sat in the corner, tablet on his lap. his expression unreadable, his silence calculated. He was letting Turner speak, letting the captain's anger burn itself out before he intervened. Turner slammed his hand down. "Say something, Sergeant." Arya's voice was calm, measured. "The hostages are alive. The enemy is captured. The pipeline they were running is exposed." Turner's face reddened. "Don't twist this into a victory speech. You broke the chain of command." Locket's voice finally cut in. "Enough." The word was sharp, final. Turner stiffened but said nothing more. The colonel leaned forward, eyes fixed on Arya. For the first time there was no dismissal in his tone, no offhand authority, only calculation. "Tell me exactly how you did it." For hours the questions came, each detail examined, each decision probed. How she mapped the compound, how she infiltrated without notice, how she manipulated the commander into surrender, how she managed to free the hostages without firing more than a single suppressed shot. Arya answered with precision, never embellishment. She gave facts, not triumphs. She let silence fill the spaces where others might have tried to dramatize. And in that silence, the weight of what she had done grew heavier, not lighter. Because silence doesn't boast, silence doesn't need to. When the debrief finally ended, Turner shoved back from the table, his fury barely contained. "You've undermined this unit. Whatever recognition comes from this, don't think it will last. You'll be remembered for insubordination, not valor." Arya met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "I don't care what I'm remembered for, sir. I care who walked out of that compound alive." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No anger, no defense, just truth. Turner left without another word. Lockett lingered, his eyes on her longer than necessary. At last he stood. His voice was flat, but something in it had shifted. "Your tactical assessment was correct. My judgment was flawed. The mission succeeded because of your actions." It wasn't praise, not fully, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was acknowledgement. Outside, the whispers had already spread. Soldiers leaned against HESCO barriers, muttering her name. Some with awe, some with skepticism, some with open resentment. The narrative was forming, twisting. Ghosted right out of their compound. She zip-tied them herself. No way, must have been staged. Intel desk jockey, really. Arya walked past it all, her silence impenetrable, but inside doubt gnawed. Was it luck or skill? Did she truly control the chaos, or did chaos simply allow her through? She remembered the commander's eyes, the humiliation burning there, the promise of vengeance unspoken. She remembered Daniel's respect, quiet but weighted with recognition. And she remembered her own moment of hesitation at the transmitter, the risk of speaking into the mic, the fear of ending her career with a single word. Every choice left scars, some visible, some not. Later in the ready room, Arya sat alone. Her rifle lay across her lap, cleaning cloth moving in slow, deliberate strokes. Each pass of the cloth steadied her pulse, calmed her breathing. Her grandfather's voice echoed with each motion, patience in every movement. The tent flap rustled. Lockett entered. He didn't sit. He stood at attention, an unusual gesture for a man of his rank. "Your report has been filed. A recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross is under review." Arya didn't look up. The cloth kept moving along the barrel. "Effective immediately," he continued. "Intelligence analysts will have tactical input authority during operational planning." Only then did she raise her eyes, calm, unyielding. "Colonel, there are more of us. Women who can move where men can't, who operate unseen because people choose not to see us." Lockett held her gaze, a long silence stretched, then stiffly he nodded. "Understood, that will be addressed." And then he was gone. The rifle lay clean across her lap. Arya sat with it, the weight familiar, grounding. But the silence in the room was different now. heavy not with dismissal but with the burden of being seen. For years she had lived in the margins, overlooked, underestimated. That invisibility had been her weapon, her shield. Now they were looking, now they were watching. And part of her wondered if being seen was more dangerous than being forgotten. That night she couldn't sleep. The barracks hummed with whispers, laughter, suspicion. Every sound carried judgment. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling the same question. Had she changed the mission? Or had the mission changed her? Because what she had done wasn't just survival, it was something else, something deeper. She had turned capture into command, and she wasn't sure she could ever go back. The desert evening settled over Red Mesa with a strange stillness. After days of dust and chaos, the air felt heavy, as if even the wind held its breath. Arya sat outside the barracks, boots planted in the dirt, rifle propped against her leg. Around her, soldiers moved in fragments, some heading for chow, others laughing in the dim light of the fire barrels. But every conversation seemed to dim when she walked past. She had become a presence they couldn't ignore, and that unsettled her more than the mission ever had. For years, invisibility had been her shield. Now she could feel their eyes. Every whisper carried weight. Every glance tested her patience. She didn't want recognition. She wanted silence. But silence was no longer hers to claim. The crunch of boots broke her thoughts. Daniel Cross approached, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his stride slower than a soldier's but steadier than a civilian's. His face carried the lines of both. He stopped a few feet away, studying her. Not the way others did, with suspicion or disbelief, but with the calm scrutiny of someone who had lived too long in shadows himself. "You move like smoke," he said at last. His voice was low, his accent clipped, the kind that carried weight without needing volume. Arya didn't look at him right away. She kept her eyes on the rifle in her lap, cloth moving along the barrel in slow, methodical strokes. "Montana winters," she said, "and a grandfather who believed the best warriors are the ones nobody sees coming." Daniel tilted his head. Sounds like he knew something the rest of the world forgets. She finally looked up. "He survived Vietnam because enemies underestimated him. He taught me to let them, to use it." A flicker of a smile touched Daniel's lips, weary but genuine. "My daughter, she wants to be a soldier. Everyone says she's too headstrong, too stubborn for the life." Arya paused, cloth resting against the metal. She saw the truth in his eyes then, the weight of a father who had lived through wars, wanting to shield his child but knowing he couldn't. "Then tell her they're wrong," Arya said softly, "and teach her to prove it. The battlefield doesn't always reward the loudest voice or the strongest arm. Sometimes victory belongs to the one nobody saw coming." The words hung between them, quiet but heavy. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Respect passed between them like a silent handshake, deeper than rank, deeper than orders. Soldier to soldier, survivor to survivor. For a long moment neither spoke. The desert wind carried the faint rattle of distant machinery, the bark of laughter from the chow tent. Life on the base moved on, but for the two of them the silence was enough. Later Arya walked the perimeter, the night pressing cool against her skin. The stars scattered above felt impossibly distant, untouchable. She thought of the hostages, faces she had freed, eyes that had looked at her with both fear and hope. She thought of the commander's humiliation, the fire in his eyes. And she thought of Turner, whose pride would never forgive her for being right. Being right had never felt so costly. She stopped at the wire, the same stretch where her rifle had been found, stained with goat's blood. To the others it had been a sign of defeat. To her it had been a mask. But masks have weight, and hers was heavy tonight. Because survival doesn't end when you walk back through the gates. Survival lingers. It sits in your chest, a restless thing, whispering questions you don't want to hear. How long before the next mission? How long before command finds a way to silence you again? How long before the men you humiliated come hunting? Her hands tightened on the wire. For the first time, she wondered not just if she could endure, but if she wanted to. Inside the operations tent, Lakach sat alone, reports spread across the table. The Pakistani broker had been tied to a hostage pipeline spanning 3 provinces. Millions in ransom money had flowed through his hands, fueling the Taliban's war machine. Arya's actions had cracked it open, exposed something larger than anyone had expected. And yet, Lakach's fingers tapped against the tablet. He knew what Turner wanted: punishment, discipline, order restored, and part of him wanted it too. Arya had broken rules, circumvented authority, acted without permission. But she had been right. The hardest truth for a commander is knowing when the rules serve the mission, and when the mission demands breaking them. Lakach closed the file. He thought of Arya's calm voice in the debrief, her unflinching eyes, her refusal to claim glory. Not arrogance, not ambition, just conviction. And conviction, he realized, was rarer than obedience. Arya returned to her bunk past midnight. The barracks was quiet now, save for the soft rhythm of breath from the soldiers asleep around her. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, unable to close her eyes. Her grandfather's words circled again and again: trust your training, not your fear. But training hadn't prepared her for this, the weight of being seen. The silence had always been her refuge, her power. Now, every whisper of her name was a reminder that invisibility was gone. She turned onto her side, eyes catching the photograph tucked under her pillow. Her grandfather, uniform faded, eyes sharp even in age. He had carried his own silence home from war. She wondered if it had weighed on him the same way it pressed against her now. She whispered into the dark, words meant only for him. I wasn't supposed to come back, but I did, and I don't know what that makes me. No answer came, only the hum of the base generator, the sigh of the desert wind. And in that silence, Arya realized something. Victory didn't erase the burden. Sometimes it made it heavier. Morning came with the sharp call of reveille, the base stirring to life once more. Arya rose, her movements efficient, disciplined, but inside the questions lingered. Was she still invisible, or had she become something else, something harder to carry? And more dangerously, what would command do with a soldier they could no longer ignore? Why did silence feel heavier now than it had in the mountains? Arya Monroe sat at the edge of the chow hall, a tin cup of coffee cooling in her hands. Around her, soldiers moved in clusters, trays clattering, voices low, the familiar rhythm of a base between missions. But each time she lifted her eyes, she felt them looking. Not openly, never openly, but enough. Once she had been background noise, now she was an interruption. Turner's laugh cut through the room, loud and sharp. He leaned over a table of rangers, his voice pitched just high enough for her to hear. Ghost stories spread fast out here. Intel Sergeant waltzes in, zip ties a platoon of Taliban. Next thing you know, they'll be saying she levitates too. Laughter followed, rough and brittle. Arya didn't react. She sipped her coffee, eyes fixed on the far wall, but the heat in her chest betrayed her calm. Turner wasn't just mocking her. He was reclaiming ground. Authority thrives on perception, and she had shaken his. He couldn't forgive that. She set the cup down, her hand steady. Outwardly, she gave him nothing. Inwardly, she reminded herself, your silence is not weakness, it's choice. Still, choice was heavier now. Colonel Lakach summoned her that afternoon. The operations tent was stripped down, maps rolled tight, chairs empty save for his. He gestured for her to sit but didn't look up from the tablet in his hands. Command's review came through, he said finally. His voice carried no warmth, only the weight of bureaucracy. Officially, your actions were unauthorized, reckless, a violation of standing orders. Arya sat still, her face unreadable. He set the tablet down, eyes meeting hers. Unofficially, your actions exposed a hostage pipeline we didn't even know existed. You cut off millions in funding. You forced the enemy to reveal vulnerabilities. You saved lives. Those are facts. A pause stretched between them. You'll remain under my command, Lokech continued. But understand this, you're visible now. There's no going back to the margins. Some will see you as an asset, others as a threat. Both can be dangerous. Arya's voice was calm. And which do you see me as, sir? Lokech studied her, his jaw tight. For the first time there was no dismissal in his eyes, only the sharp weight of calculation. That depends on whether you can carry the burden you've created. She didn't answer. Some burdens weren't meant to be shared. Night settled across Red Mesa, carrying with it a tension sharper than the desert cold. Daniel Cross found her again, this time near the motor pool, where trucks sat in neat lines, engines cooling from maintenance drills. He leaned against the hood of a Hilux, arms crossed, studying her. "You don't flinch," he said quietly. Arya raised a brow. "Should I?" "Most people would. After what you pulled, half the base wants your story to crumble. The other half wants to use it for their own agendas." "And you?" she asked. He shrugged, the motion weary. "I've seen soldiers break for less. I've also seen the quiet ones endure far longer than anyone expects. My money's on the latter." Arya's lips curved faintly, but it wasn't a smile. "Survival isn't about money." "No," Daniel agreed. "It's about will, and you've got that in spades." Silence settled, companionable but fragile. For a moment, Arya felt the edges of her burden soften. Not disappear, but soften. At 200, the first reprisal came. The perimeter alarm screamed into the night, jolting the base awake. Searchlights swept across the wire, catching figures darting into the scrub. A dozen fighters, maybe more, rifles flashing in brief bursts. The guards on the towers returned fire, tracers streaking red through the dark. Arya was already moving, rifle in hand, her body running on instinct. She reached the wall just as one of the Hilux trucks at the gate exploded into flames. The same truck she had sabotaged days earlier. A bitter twist of irony. Her sabotage had saved her once, but it hadn't stopped them from learning. The firefight was brief but vicious. By 2:30, the bodies of 3 Taliban fighters lay twisted in the dust, their attack repelled. The rest melted into the night, leaving behind only the acrid stench of burned fuel and blood. But the message was clear. Arya had humiliated them, and humiliation demands answer. At dawn, Lokech's briefing was taut, clipped. He paced the tent, his voice edged with steel. "They hit us because they want her." His eyes flicked to Arya. "They'll keep coming until they erase the stain she left on them. That makes her both target and leverage." Turner leaned forward, seizing the opening. "Then confine her. Keep her locked down until this passes. She's a liability in the field." Arya's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. Lokech's gaze shifted between them, weighing, calculating. Then he spoke. "No, if they want her, we use that. We turn their obsession into bait. We set the trap." Turner's face twisted. "You can't be serious." Lokech's tone cut sharp. "I'm not asking for your approval, Captain. I'm giving orders." The room fell silent. Arya said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than argument. But inside, the storm built. Not fear for herself, but fear for what her presence would draw onto others. She had spent her life invisible. Now, the very fact of being seen threatened everyone around her. That evening, she walked the perimeter again, the desert wind pressing cold against her skin. Her mind circled the same question. Had survival turned her into a weapon or a liability? She stopped at the wire, staring out into the darkness where the enemy had come from. The sand stretched endless, indifferent. Somewhere out there, men were planning, waiting, plotting how to reclaim what she had stolen from them. For the first time since the mission, Arya felt something colder than fear settle in her chest. Not for herself, but for the inevitability of what was coming. Reprisal wasn't just possible, it was certain. And this time, it wouldn't stop at the wire. The desert night was darker than usual, clouds swallowing the stars. Arya Monroe crouched beside the wire, rifle steady across her lap, listening to the silence. She knew the silence well, the way it carried warnings, the way it stretched too long before breaking. Tonight, it was the kind of silence that made even seasoned soldiers shift their grip on their rifles. She wasn't here to listen, though. She was here to be seen. That was Locketch's plan. The briefing had been sharp, clipped. Locketch stood at the map table, his voice hard steel. They want her, we give them her, but on our terms. They'll come for her again. We make the bait impossible to resist. Turner had nearly come out of his chair. This is madness. She's not bait, she's a liability. Locketch's eyes cut toward him, cold. No, Captain, she's leverage. She draws them in, we close the trap. End this cycle before it escalates. Arya had said nothing. Not when Locketch outlined the plan. Not when Turner's fury boiled into mutters about arrogance and insubordination. She had only asked one question. What happens if the trap closes late? No one had answered. Now crouched against the wire, Arya let her breathing steady. The Rangers were out there too, concealed in the scrub, rifles trained on the dark horizon. Drones circled high above, their feeds streaming into silent command tents. Somewhere behind her, Turner paced like a caged animal, forced to depend on the very woman he despised. It was a strange kind of power, to be the one the enemy wanted most, and the one your own command distrusted. Strange and heavy. Her grandfather's words returned again, as they always did in the quiet. Trust your training, not your fear. But what if fear was the only honest thing left? At 200, the night broke. Shadows flickered along the ridge, figures moving low, careful, confident. Arya's eyes tracked them with the cold precision of instinct. A dozen at first, then more, 20, maybe 30. The Taliban had come. Her throat tightened, not with fear for herself, but with the weight of knowing what her presence had drawn. These men weren't just hunting a soldier. They were hunting a symbol. Her humiliation of their commander had burned too deep to be ignored. Through her earpiece, Turner's voice snapped. Hold positions, let them get closer. Arya stayed still, head bowed, posture bent into the hunch of vulnerability. To the fighters approaching, she was the same faceless villager they had once overlooked. But this time, she was meant to be recognized. Her chest rose and fell slow, measured. Each step they took closer pressed her pulse tighter against her ribs. At 50 meters, the fighters fanned out, their silhouettes bristling with rifles. One barked an order. The line shifted, circling. Arya's hand tightened on her rifle, but she didn't move. Not yet. Then a voice rang sharp across the dark, Pashto, guttural, mocking. They knew her name. The commander's voice. Her jaw clenched. He had come himself. Turner's voice hissed in her ear. Wait for my mark, don't move. But Arya's instincts flared. This wasn't right. The fighters weren't reckless. They weren't charging. They were waiting. Her mind raced. Why wait? And then she saw it. The glint on the ridge, the faint shift of a barrel, sniper. The trap was folding back on itself. She whispered into the mic, calm but sharp. They know, snipers on the ridge, pull the men back. Silence. Then Turner's growl. You don't give orders, Sergeant. Hold your position. Arya's pulse hammered. If she obeyed, men would die. If she disobeyed, she'd confirm every accusation Turner had hurled at her. Choice pressed like a blade against her throat. She closed her eyes. Trust your training, not your fear. Her voice cut through the channel, steady as stone. Counter-sniper team, adjust 30 degrees north. Ridge line, fire on my mark. The channel erupted with protests, Turner's fury, Locketch's barked command. But the counter-snipers hesitated only a moment. They trusted instinct more than politics. Arya's eyes locked on the ridge, her breath slowed. 1, 2. Mark. The night exploded. Rifles cracked, muzzle flashes blooming along the ridge. Two silhouettes toppled, weapons clattering against stone. The fighters below jerked in shock, their circle breaking. And then the Rangers opened fire. Chaos tore the silence apart. Arya dropped flat, rifle braced, her shots precise, measured. She wasn't fighting for glory. She was fighting to end this fast, to keep the weight of her presence from costing more lives. Bullets chewed the dirt near her boots. She rolled, fired, rolled again. Her world narrowed to angles, breath, recoil. Through the chaos, she saw him. The commander, his face lit by muzzle flashes, his fury burning like a beacon. He wasn't aiming. He wasn't hiding. He was hunting her with his eyes. Their gazes locked. And in that moment, Arya understood. This wasn't just about humiliation. This was personal. He raised his rifle. Her shot came first. He dropped, dust swallowing his body. The circle of fighters faltered, broken without their center. Within minutes, it was over. The survivors scattered into the scrub, chased by tracer fire until the night swallowed them whole. Silence returned, not peace, just silence. Arya stayed low, chest heaving, the smell of gunpowder thick in her throat. Turner's voice finally crackled through the comms, tight with fury. "You just disobeyed a direct order, again." Arya's voice was calm. "I saved your men." Static answered her. Back at the fob, the tension was heavier than the firefight. Rangers moved in silence, eyes flicking between her and Turner, caught in the space between resentment and reluctant respect. Turner stormed into Lakech's office, his voice carrying through the canvas walls. "She undermined me in the field, twice. If you don't strip her now, you'll never have control of this unit again." Arya stood outside, silent, hearing every word. Lakech's reply was lower, harder to catch, but she heard the final line. "She's already proven control isn't about orders. It's about results." The words cut sharp, because results were what had saved them. But results never come without cost. That night, Arya sat alone by the wire, the desert stretching endless before her. Her rifle rested across her knees, her breath slow, her body weary. She had survived again, not by luck, not by strength, but by refusing silence when silence meant death. And yet the cost lingered. Turner's hatred had hardened into something more dangerous than rivalry. Command had begun to shift, balancing between obedience and trust. And the enemy, they had lost their commander but not their resolve. The war wasn't done with her. Not yet. And Arya Monroe knew the hardest battle was still coming, the one she could not fight with a rifle alone. Why was it harder to breathe now that the fight was over? Arya Monroe sat on the cot in her barracks, boots unlaced, rifle leaning against the wall. The desert outside was quiet again, but inside her chest the storm hadn't settled. Victory had come, again, but it hadn't lifted the weight pressing down on her. Because survival doesn't erase what's been done, survival adds to it. Every whisper outside the tent reminded her of it. Soldiers spoke her name now, not as background noise but as story. Some with awe, some with suspicion, some with resentment sharp enough to cut. And none of it felt like her. She had been invisible, and invisibility had been freedom. But now her silence carried too much meaning to ever vanish again. In the operations tent, Lakech stared down at after-action reports, his fingers tapping against the table. Turner stood stiff nearby, fury leaking through every clipped breath. "She undermined me again," Turner snapped. "She broke command in the middle of combat. She disobeyed again." Lakech didn't look up, and saved 12 lives. "That's not the point." "It is the point," Lakech cut in, his voice sharp. "You had the authority, she had the instinct, and instinct won." Turner's fists clenched. He wanted blood, discipline, punishment, erasure, but command had shifted. Slowly, reluctantly, it had tilted toward her, and Turner knew it. That knowledge burned hotter than any defeat. Lakech finally met his eyes. Control doesn't come from shouting orders. It comes from making sure your men walk back alive. Learn that or you'll lose them. And her. Turner's silence was darker than words. He left without salute. Lakech exhaled slowly. He had never expected to be taught by the quietest sergeant under his command. But here he was, weighing his pride against her truth. Arya found Daniel Cross at the edge of the airstrip that evening. He sat on a stack of crates, watching the horizon where the last light bled from the sky. "You knew they'd come for you again," he said, not turning as she approached. Arya shrugged. "I knew humiliation doesn't die quietly." Daniel studied her, eyes lined with years of battles that had stolen too much and given back too little. "You carry yourself like someone who's already accepted the cost." Arya sat beside him, her voice quiet. "I accepted it the day I put on this uniform. What I didn't expect was how heavy it feels to be seen." He nodded, understanding without judgment. The loud ones never understand that part. Being invisible is a gift. Once it's gone, you can't ever get it back. The runway lights flickered on, washing the desert in pale glow. Arya traced the cracks in the asphalt with her eyes silent. Daniel spoke again, softer this time. "When you pulled me out of that cellar, I thought you were just another ghost. Then you handed me a Glock and I realized you weren't a ghost at all. You were the kind of soldier they'll never know how to write about. Too quiet to fit their stories. Too precise to fit their legends." She turned to him, her face unreadable but her eyes steady. "I don't want to be a legend." "Good," Daniel said. "Legends are loud. You're better than that. You're proof." She frowned slightly. "Proof of what?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That the strongest soldier isn't always the one shouting orders. Sometimes it's the one nobody noticed until it was too late to stop her." His words sank deep. She didn't answer, she didn't need to. Days blurred into each other, patrols rotated, reports piled. The war didn't stop for anyone's story, not hers, not Turner, not even Lakech. But the air around Red Mesa was different now, heavier. The Taliban had retreated, licking their wounds. But everyone knew they would return. Humiliation doesn't fade, it festers. Arya moved through the base with her usual quiet precision, but she felt the stares sharpen. Men who once dismissed her now measured themselves against her shadow, some with respect, some with envy, some with fear. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "Legends are loud. You're better than that." But silence was no longer refuge. Silence was expectation. And that expectation pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Turner cornered her near the motor pool one evening. His face was tight, his eyes sharp with something deeper than anger. "You think you've won," he hissed. "You think they respect you now, but respect fades. Command fades, stories fade. You'll be forgotten, Monroe, and when you are, you'll wish you listened." Arya met his glare without flinching. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "I don't care about respect. I care about lives." He sneered, but the words landed. They always did, because Turner had never been able to separate pride from purpose, and Arya had never let pride touch her. He turned away, his bitterness spilling into the dirt with each step. Arya watched him go, not with anger but with something closer to pity. Because pride was its own kind of prison, and Turner had locked himself inside it. On her last night before rotation, Arya walked the perimeter again. The wire stretched into the desert, a line of steel and shadow. Beyond it, the horizon waited, endless and indifferent. She stopped where her rifle had once been found, stained with goat's blood, the place where the story had begun. The air was still, the silence familiar, but it wasn't the same silence anymore. She had entered this war as invisible. She had survived by being unseen. But somewhere along the way, she had learned that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes, silence is the sharpest presence of all. Her grandfather's voice echoed in memory. Trust your training, not your fear. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night. I did. Daniel found her there, standing at the wire, her silhouette framed against the desert sky. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. Finally, he said, My daughter, she want to hear your story. Arya shook her head. Don't tell her mine, tell her yours. He frowned. Why? Because my story isn't about being loud, she said softly. It's about being invisible until it mattered. And if she learns anything from me, let it be this: dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. The desert wind stirred the wire. The silence stretched. And Arya Monroe, the intel sergeant who was never supposed to be seen, stood unflinching against it. Not a legend, not a ghost. Just proof.